Rosie Jones, welcome to our Eden series of videos for YouTube. Now, as a keynote speaker this morning, you spoke about the future of the Open University. Can you tell me a little bit about what you consider to be the trends of future libraries?
I don't know that it's that much different, actually. So I suppose I picked up on two key themes that I think are important to libraries. And the more I go out and talk about libraries, the more I feel like they're spot on, actually, going forward. So one was around moving libraries beyond the physical space. So we're really guilty as librarians of almost categorising the library as this physical book collection, and it is. You know, that's still really quite important in a lot of university libraries, but actually thinking about our spaces in a virtual campus, I think is increasingly important, not just for the OU, but for other library environments. And I suppose it picks up on the theme of the diversity, really. So, you know, students, not just OU students, want to access universities when they want, as they want. And actually the online element really is important to that. So I think we need to push the boundaries of what an online library service is. And that was, I talked about many things around that, but some of that was around how do you replicate physical learning spaces in an online environment? How do you kind of create that community feel, that safe environment, that feeling of scholarship? So for me, that's my first point about what I think the future is. Yeah. And then the second point is what's coming out at the OU at the moment, which is thinking about digital by design. So again, thinking beyond replicating the physical. So this is what a university already does, so we now have to think, how do you do that in an online environment? Actually, let's kind of scrap that and think about what it looks like digitally. So let's actually design it digitally in the first place. Let's not replicate.
I'm glad you said that, because I remember back when Second Life was just starting in 2007, 2008, and I remember lots of universities jumping on the bandwagon and creating spaces which were basically replications of physical spaces in the real world. Yeah. Was that a mistake, do you think, that we're replicating in some distance in virtual systems?
I think it was probably a mistake that needed to be made.
Right.
But you're completely right. When that sort of initiative started, I think there were kind of people were surprised by the fact that people weren't taking up these replications, as you say. I think what we have to think about in the digital is the added value, the opportunities that the digital provides. So yes, you might want to create the kind of feelings of engagement or the way that people interact, but you don't have to do it with a replication of a person talking to a person, in this virtual environment, or the physical space looking like the physical space does in the real world. So yeah, not a mistake, but I think we've got a lot of lessons learnt from that. I would never want to replicate just our library in a virtual world, that it looks like that in a way.
I was an undergraduate at the OU back in the 90s, and I remember receiving lots of paper-based materials through the post every other week and doing my TMAs and sending them off and getting them marked by hand by one of my tutors and so on. If I went back to the OU now, what would be the differences?
Well, there wouldn't be a difference in terms of the passion about the OU. So I talked about that earlier, that I cannot believe the passion for what the OU is trying to achieve. People genuinely believe in the mission of the OU. It really kind of sits in their heart. So that's not really changed. You would not get the same level of paper content coming to you. But maybe we haven't changed it enough yet. So the demand for paper and print is still there. We still get that kind of request. If I asked all my students at the OU, do you want a physical book or an online book? They would all turn around to me and say a physical book. But I don't ask them, because I do not have the freedom to replicate that for 170,000 students. So I think what you'd see is a changing journey. We don't provide resources in the same way that you experienced, but I don't think we're at the end of that evolution yet. So students do still get core text at the beginning of their course. And I suppose in a way they do still get a lot of module material fed to them. And I think we're on our next step really now. So we're at the step where we we almost stopped doing, I've thought about this a bit recently. Libraries, when I talk to other librarians, they keep on saying to me, when we survey students, they want more physical books. But I actually think we might be doing students a disservice. So actually some of it is about changing behaviour and about helping students survive in a digital society. Because actually when they go into the world of work, you don't have the same access to a physical library collection. So we need to teach them how to find the information that they need electronically and in a suitable format. So yeah, you'll see an evolution of the OU, I think, if you went back there.
Of course, there are a whole range of digital literacies, aren't there now, that we need to start thinking about, because when students, or indeed anyone in the public domain, actually accesses online or digital content, there are things they need to know. What's your role in educating people in that area?
Well, it's quite exciting, actually. So my background is information literacy, and I remember early days of information literacy. Libraries had this kind of really tight framework, and they said, right, we don't help with X because it doesn't fit with information literacy. But you're right, Steve, when you identify like those other literacies, they all sit in this kind of overlapping kind of circles. And the poor students initially from libraries were getting this experience where you'd say, well, I can help to this point, but after that, we don't do that bit of that work. So I started to see that change when I was at Manchester. We introduced a programme called My Learning Essentials, where we started to teach academic skills as well. And actually, it was such a great fit, and it complemented what we did as a library. And that it became easier as a librarian to help a student. So the next stage for me is going into that kind of digital literacy, digital capabilities type of area. And again, I think it's a really good fit. I'm really excited that we as a library are leading that at the OU, but often it's not necessarily seen as the natural fit. People have said, you know, it's IT that should lead it, it's the academics that should lead it, but I actually think that the overlap with information literacy is huge. So the digital capabilities is really about surviving in that digital world. So it's about, I suppose, identifying the tools that you need digitally, about keeping on top of the digital world. So it's not about just teaching a piece of software. It's not about saying, well, you're going to need to be able to use, I don't know, Yammer going forward, because actually we all know that the software doesn't stay, but it's about that discerning what's quality and what's going to, you know, what skills you need to be able to exploit technology.
You're right to identify the volatile nature of things like social media, for instance, and also even digital platforms. We see them coming and going and coming and going, don't we? So how do we prepare for a future where we have that kind of volatile nature and we don't know what's coming next?
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? So I suppose it's taking it back to a skills element. So it's almost like we do with quality information. So it's discerning being able to make those kind of choices between those platforms about what's next or what is going to be big or what is worth your time and your investment. So in my mind, it's almost about the awareness. It's about being able to keep yourself up to date and informed. And understanding how you know what's worth time and investment. I've seen initiatives, and again at Manchester we were doing just this, where we'd present to the students and to staff 6 different options of something that did the same thing, and we'd do the legwork for those students and staff and say, look, this is the good point and this is the bad point, and this is what it potentially could do for you. And in a way, that started to help them choose whether they wanted to engage at all, and if they did, which to choose out of the 6 that suited them. And I think we could do more, I suppose, curation maybe of digital software. So we could actually, we could start to help with that evaluation and that choice.
Is there a role for students in curation as well?
Oh gosh, yes. That would be great, and that would increase capacity straight away, but also actually, you know, libraries are using more UX methodology in their design. We've at last realised that we don't always know what's best for our students. So we would really value that input, I think.
What other plans might there be for the future?
I suppose if we talk about libraries specifically, I think a big agenda for libraries at the moment is looking at the skills that we have as professionals. And I suppose in a way it's so that we can respond in an agile way to what's next. I'm constantly working with my team to be resilient to change, not resistant, please don't be resistant. So resilient to change, because I need to be able to flex my team and my workforce to respond to what's next. So I suppose that's a huge thing for libraries, because if you think, you must know stories yourself about this, but libraries struggle slightly with turning their kind of traditional methods into what's new. So, you know, you can already see it with, I suppose, how big cataloguing departments are now within university libraries. They've reduced because we start to get more shelf-ready books. But actually, that turn was really quite slow. So I think that's a massive thing for libraries going forward. And then I think the areas that I'm growing and developing tend to be the areas that are a little bit more outward facing. So we really recognise at the OU that our strength comes when we collaborate and we communicate with others. So again, this morning I talked about learning analytics. Yeah. You know, that's really important, but it's important that we don't do that in isolation within the library. So that's all about collaboration, making sure that we feed into data warehouses, that we know how to respond to information, that we get the right and the accurate advice. So I would say the future for me is more outward facing. It's more about us collaborating, about us stepping outside of the library and being responsive to the needs of the university.
I was going to ask you about learner analytics. I was going to ask you about how can we, how does big data, when you gather it from things like the use of an LMS, you know, learning management system, how does that actually help us, inform us in individualized learning, you know, personalized learning? Is there an outcome that would actually promote that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So I talked this morning about we've started to see a correlation between increased electronic usage and student attainment. But of course, like everything else with learning analytics, there are other factors there. And how do we know that tiny element there is the factor? Because actually, students who are more engaged with the library are actually probably more engaged students, full stop. Yeah. So, you know, how do we know that it's having that link? And we don't have the control students that we take everything away from to be able to show that that's happening.
I think the same applies to MOOCs, doesn't it? Yeah. In that sense, we know from data that's been received over the last 5 years or so of the evolution of MOOCs as they've become more platform oriented, that the students who do well and the students who persist, that don't fall off the end, are those who have done it before in some way. I mean, is there anything you could say about that in terms of OU students? You said there wasn't a typical OU student, didn't you? But aren't they more kind of savvy in terms of technology?
I think you'd probably think that, but I'm not sure it's actually true. So that's why the digital capability work is so important. Yeah. And that's students and staff, actually, because it's just a minefield, isn't it, to keep on top of all of this. And yeah, without stereotyping our students, they often, whilst we say there's not a typical, they probably are juggling a extremely busy life. So they could be working at the same time as studying, or they could be juggling a family. So actually having the time to digitally engage is quite difficult, I think. Back to the learning analytics and kind of what we can do with that. For me, the important thing isn't so much, I don't want data that just proves the value of a library. I want data that allows me to have interactions with students to improve their learning experience. And libraries have always struggled to prove our impact. You know, where everybody knows a library is a great thing, but me being able to quantify to you what impact we have is really difficult. But in some ways, I don't care about quantifying it.
Yeah.
I care about making a better student experience. So I actually think the learning analytics for us is about making sure we can provide the help, the support, the interventions when we think they're needed. And whether we can prove that that was the point or not, I think we'll start to hear from our students whether it was. So if they've got a better experience, that's what I care about.
Got one final question for you, and that is one of your statements this morning about the aspirations of the Open University to be the university in the cloud. What does that look like? What will it be?
Gosh, I don't know whether I can answer it for the university itself. But when I answer it for the library, again, I think it's switching our whole approach to what our presence is. So I've got visions of, students being able to go on to, I suppose, straight into a learning environment where the holding space is actually a library space, where they can accidentally meet with other students virtually and they happen to be studying the same sort of thing. They could be doing a literature review, but they're not necessarily studying the same subject area, so they start to have the meetups, they start to speak like that. We use technology where I'm reading this resource, you're reading that resource, we might meet up, or I'm reading this resource, here's a whole other selection of other things that you might want to know about. I think that for me, that's what I was thinking of, is this kind of this library digital environment that's beyond anything that we've got so far, that allows our students to feel like they've got a home, I suppose, at the university. That would be an important thing for me. But I can only really answer it on behalf of the library at the moment.
Rosie, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.